The first official meeting of the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association convened not in a stuffy community hall, but in the blindingly white minimalist living room of Carol Covington. The air, smelling faintly of lemon polish and righteous indignation, was thick with purpose. Carol, perched on the edge of a white leather sofa, so pristine it looked like it had been sculpted from a glacier, tapped a perfectly manicured nail on the cover of a thick, freshly printed binder. The binder's title, embossed in gold foil, read, Whispering Pines Estates HOA, Bylaws, Covenants, and Community Standards, First Edition, Item the First, Carol announced, her voice as crisp as the crease in her beige linen trousers. The formal ratification of the association's founding. She looked expectantly at the two other people in the room. Across from her, sinking into a matching white armchair like a marshmallow in a microwave, was Brenda Gables. Brenda, a woman whose natural state was a low-grade panic, nervously adjusted her oversized glasses. Oh, absolutely. Carol ratified 100%. She nodded so vigorously her floral print blouse rustled in protest. To Carol's left, standing ramrod straight near the fireplace which, per Carol's own design, had never seen a log, was Gary Abernathy. Gary was a retired security guard from a shopping mall, a fact he rarely mentioned but which informed his entire bearing. He had donned a navy blue polo shirt with a crudely embroidered patch over the paquita, pine tree, and the letters WPEHOA Security, affirmative. Chairperson Covington, he grunted, his chest puffed out. Founding is a go. Carol allowed herself a small, tight smile. It was perfect. Order from chaos. For months, ever since her husband Richard had traded their 25 years of meticulously planned life for a 25-year-old yoga instructor named Sunshine, Carol's world had been chaos. Richard had called her controlling. Sunshine had probably called her worse. But they didn't understand. Control wasn't a flaw. It was a virtue. Control was what separated civilization from savagery. Manicured lawns from overgrown weeds. Whispering Pines Estates from the kind of place that would tolerate Jedediah Stone's barn. Excellent, Carol said, flipping open the binder. Brenda, as secretary, you've recorded the motion. With a gold star. Brenda chirped, holding up a notepad where she'd scrawled meeting number 1, we are real. Carol wisely chose to ignore the annotation. Gary, as head of community compliance and safety, you are prepared to enforce the bylaws as written. Gary placed a hand over his self-made patch. To the letter, ma'am, no gray areas. Only black and white, and approved shades of beige for exterior paint. Very good, Carol said, her gaze drifting out the expansive picture window. Her house sat on a gentle rise, affording her a panoramic view of the neighborhood, a collection of a dozen or so large, modern homes on spacious lots carved out of the North Georgia woods. It was a beautiful area, but it lacked cohesion. It lacked standards. There was no formal HOA, a fact that had grated on Carol since she'd moved in. The developer had gone bankrupt before establishing one, leaving a power vacuum she was uniquely qualified to fill. And her gaze inevitably landed on the source of the community's most egregious aesthetic wound. Jedediah Stone's property. It was the oldest plot, nestled at the end of the main road. His house was a modest but well-kept ranch, but behind it, an affront to all that was decent and orderly, stood a massive, red-painted barn. It was a relic from when this land was just a farm, a grotesque monument to agricultural squalor. It had no place among homes with 3-car garages and professionally designed water features. Which brings us, Carol said, her voice dropping an octave, to item the second. The most pressing violation of community standards. The unapproved, non-compliant, and frankly, unsightly agricultural structure on Lot 12? Brenda leaned forward, her eyes wide. The barn, Carol confirmed, her lips thinning into a razor line. It's a blight. It lowers property values. Can you imagine prospective buyers driving through our lovely community, only to see that? She shuddered theatrically. It screams yokel. It must be addressed. Gary cracked his knuckles. What's the protocol, chairperson? A verbal warning. We are beyond verbal warnings, Carol stated, her tone imbued with the gravity of a general planning an invasion. This is not a negotiation. This is a restoration of order. I have prepared the initial notice of violation. It cites Section 4, Article B, Subsection 9 of the bylaws. Brenda squinted. Did we write that section yet? I wrote it last night, Carol said smoothly. It specifically prohibits any outbuilding exceeding 200 square feet that is not architecturally harmonious with the primary residence. His barn is, by my estimation, at least 3,000 square feet, and is harmonious with nothing but livestock, which, I will remind you, are also explicitly forbidden by Section 6, Article C. Brilliant, Carol, just brilliant, Brenda breathed, fanning herself with her notepad. The notice gives him 30 days to submit a plan for the structure's complete removal, Carol continued. If he fails to comply, fines will begin to accrue. Daily? Gary's eyes lit up. Fines. I like the sound of that. How do we deliver the notice? A predatory gleam entered Carol's eyes. This was the part she craved, the confrontation. The moment where her carefully constructed authority met the untidy reality of another person's free will. It was a test. "We deliver it in person," she declared, snapping the binder shut. "As a committee, it's important that he understands the seriousness of this, that he sees the unified front of the Homeowners Association." Unified front? Got it, Gary said, squaring his shoulders. Should I wear something official?" Brenda asked, looking down at her blouse. Carol surveyed her for a moment. "Just try not to spill anything on yourself, Brenda. Now, let's go. Order awaits." Jedediah Stone was humming an old Johnny Cash tune as he replaced a rotted fence post. The mid-morning sun was warm on his back, and the air smelled of pine and rich earth. At 68, he moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who had spent a lifetime working with his hands. After 20 years in the army, and another 20 as a master carpenter, Jed didn't waste movement, and he didn't waste words. He valued peace, quiet, and the solid feel of the land under his feet, land his grandfather had farmed and his late wife, Martha, had loved with all her heart. The barn had been Martha's dream project. They had spent the first 5 years of his retirement restoring it together. It wasn't for livestock. It was his workshop. Inside, the scent of sawdust and linseed oil filled the air. One half was a sprawling woodshop filled with gleaming saws, lathes, and planers where he crafted custom furniture. The other half was Martha's domain, now a memorial to her. It was a pristine studio, her easel still standing by the large north-facing window, a half-finished canvas of the surrounding hills resting upon it. The barn wasn't just a building. It was a sanctuary of memory and purpose. He heard the crunch of tires on the gravel of the access road, but it was the type of crunch that made him pause. Not the familiar rumble of the mail carrier's truck or the slow pass of a neighbor out for a walk. This was hesitant, yet determined. He straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a worn leather glove, and saw them. The delegation, Carol Covington, his newish neighbor from up the hill, was marching toward him like she was about to accept the surrender of a defeated army. She was flanked by the perpetually nervous-looking woman and the fellow who seemed to think he was a character in a bad cop movie. Jed had seen him patrolling the neighborhood in a golf cart with a flashing yellow light on top. "Morning, Carol," Jed said, his voice a low, calm rumble. He leaned the new fence post against the wire. Carol stopped precisely 5 feet from his property line, as if crossing it would expose her to some sort of contagion. Brenda hovered behind her, clutching a notepad to her chest like a shield. Gary took up a flanking position, arms crossed, legs slightly apart in what he clearly thought was an intimidating stance. "Mr. Stone," Carol began, foregoing any pleasantries. She held up a clipboard with a single, pristine sheet of paper attached. "I am here in my official capacity as chairperson of the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association." Jed raised an eyebrow. "Is that a fact? Didn't know we had one of those." "It was ratified this morning," she said, undeterred. "And as our first official act, we are addressing the most significant covenant violation in the community." She nodded toward the barn. That Jed followed her gaze, looking at the big red structure, a familiar warmth spreading through his chest. "She's a beauty, ain't she? Put a new tin roof on her last spring, Mr. Stone." "This is not a negotiation," Carol snapped, her patience already wearing thin. "This structure is in direct violation of Section 4, Article B, Subsection 9 of the HOA bylaws. It is an unapproved, non-harmonious outbuilding." She stepped forward, extending the clipboard over the invisible line of his property. "This is a formal notice of violation. You have 30 days to present the association with a detailed plan for its complete and total removal." Jed looked from the paper to her stony face, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his lips. It started in his eyes, a crinkle of pure amusement. He didn't take the clipboard. "Ma'am," he said, his voice still gentle but with an edge of... The sound of the phone dialing seemed to hang in the morning air, each tone a tiny hammer blow against the fragile shell of Carol Covington's authority. Jedediah Stone stood calmly, his phone held to his ear, a sentinel of quiet confidence. Behind her pathetic, beautiful barricade, Carol felt a tremor of something she hadn't experienced in years. Helplessness. It was a vile, foreign sensation, and she immediately fought to suppress it, smothering it with a thick blanket of righteous anger. "This is a scare tactic," she hissed, more to herself than to her two acolytes. "He's bluffing. The sheriff's department has more important things to do than respond to a petty property dispute." Gary, however, seemed to be shrinking inside his high-visibility vest. "Carol, impeding a government operation? That sounds ... official, like really official, not like our kind of official." "Don't be a fool, Gary," Carol snapped her voice. A low, dangerous whip crack. "We are official. He is the one creating the disturbance. Brenda, get your notepad. Document Mr. Stone's provocative stance. Note the time. Note his use of a telecommunication device for purposes of intimidation." Brenda, whose hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her pen, scribbled something that looked more like a seismograph reading than legible text. "Intimidotion," she mumbled. "Got it?" Jed lowered his phone. "He's on his way. Carol, he said, his voice carrying easily across the short distance. Frank's duty sergeant said he was just down on the county line. Should be about 10 minutes. He said, and I quote, to not go anywhere. He sounded real interested in your banner. The casual use of the sheriff's first name, Frank, was a calculated blow, and it landed perfectly. It established a familiarity, a connection to the world of real power that Carol could only mimic. She was an outsider playing dress-up, and Jed had just reminded her of it. We have no intention of going anywhere, Carol declared, lifting her chin. We welcome the sheriff's intervention. He is an agent of the law, an agent of order. He will appreciate our initiative in maintaining community standards. She was building a narrative in her own mind, a fantasy where Sheriff Miller would arrive, clap her on the shoulder, and congratulate her for her civic-mindedness. He would see her binder, recognize a kindred spirit in the pursuit of regulation, and then turn his official wrath upon the true transgressor, Jedediah Stone. This mental fiction was not just a hope, it was a necessity. The alternative that she was a criminal making a fool of herself was too monstrous to contemplate. The next 10 minutes stretched into an eternity. The sun climbed higher, making the vinyl of her banner gleam and the orange of the cones seem almost painfully bright. Gary tried to adopt a new, more official-looking stance, alternating between crossing his arms and putting his hands on his hips. Brenda had resorted to nervously plucking at a loose thread on her tracksuit bottoms. Only Carol and Jed remained still, locked in a silent battle of wills across the debris-strewn stage she had created. Then they heard it, a distant, rising siren. It wasn't a long, panicked wail, but a series of short, authoritative whoops, sound of a driver clearing a path, not racing to a disaster. The sound grew louder, closer, until a crisp, white Cherokee with the official seal of the Oconee County Sheriff's Department on its doors rounded the corner. It slowed to a crawl, the siren dying with a final, mournful sigh. The blue and red lights continued to flash, painting the trees, the houses, and the faces of Carol's comedians strobing, accusatory colors. The vehicle stopped 20 feet from the barricade. The driver's side door opened, and a man unfolded himself from the seat. He was tall and broad, with a sun-weathered face and a head of short, graying hair. He wore the tan uniform of the sheriff's department, but he wore it with the comfortable ease of a man who has lived in it for decades. A pair of mirrored sunglasses hid his eyes, but his mouth was set in a firm, unimpressed line. This was Sheriff Frank Miller, and he radiated an aura of calm, unforced authority that made Gary Abernathy's posturing look like a child playing soldier. The sheriff took off his sunglasses, letting them hang from the collar of his shirt. He surveyed the synthocones, the splintered sawhorses, the banner, the three figures standing beside it with a slow, deliberate gaze. He didn't look angry. He looked tired. It was the look of a man who had been hoping for a quiet Tuesday, and had been handed this absurdity instead. Ignoring Carol completely, he walked toward the edge of the lawn where Jed was standing. Jedediah, the sheriff said, his voice a gravelly baritone. You want to tell me why it looks like the county fair set up a toll booth in the middle of your road? Morning, Frank, Jed replied, his tone respectful but easy. That's what I was hoping you could tell me. Seems my neighbor, Ms. Covington here, has started her own government. This is their first official act. Sheriff Miller finally turned his full attention to Carol. For a moment, he just looked at her, his gaze taking in her immaculate linen suit and her rigid, defiant posture. Ma'am, he said, I'm Sheriff Miller. What seems to be the problem here? This was her moment. The cavalry had arrived, and it was time to give a report. She stepped forward, clasping her hands primly in front of her. Sheriff, thank you for your prompt response. I am Carol Covington, chairperson of the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association. She gestured grandly at her surroundings. As you can see, we have been forced to take action against a resident in gross violation of our community covenants. The sheriff's eyes flickered to the banner, then back to her. Your homeowners association. I got the file for this subdivision. In my office, there is no HOA for Whispering Pines. There is now, Carol stated proudly. It was ratified this morning by the founding board. She indicated Brenda and Gary. We are it. A muscle twitched in the sheriff's jaw. It might have been the beginnings of a smile, or a grimace of disbelief. You, ratified it this morning. The three of you. That's correct, Carol said. And our first order of business was to address this. She pointed a finger at the barn, which stood silent and majestic in the morning light. An illegal, unapproved, agricultural structure that is severely impacting our property values. It's a barn, ma'am, the sheriff said flatly. It's been there for 60 years. It is a violation, Carol insisted, her voice rising slightly. And when Mr. Stone refused to comply with our legal notices, she held up her binder for emphasis. We were forced to restrict his access to the offending structure as per our bylaws. Sheriff Miller looked at the binder in her hand as if it were a strange, unidentifiable creature. Ma'am, let me see that. Triumphantly, Carol handed it over. This was it. He would see her meticulous research, her perfectly formatted rules. He would understand. The sheriff took the heavy binder. He didn't open it. He just tested its weight in his hand. Ma'am, he began, his voice taking on the slow, patient tone one uses with a particularly stubborn child. Let me explain how the law works here in the real world. You can't just write a bunch of rules in a book, ratify them with your friends over coffee, and then use them to block a public thoroughfare. That's not an HOA, that's a book club with delusions of grandeur. Brenda let out a small, terrified whimper. Gary's face had gone pale. Carol's face hardened. With all due respect, Sheriff, we are a legitimate community organization. No, you're not, he cut her off, his patience clearly evaporating. A legitimate HOA is a legal entity, incorporated with the state, with covenants that are attached to the deeds of the properties it governs. Your little binder here, he tapped it with his finger, is not a legal document. It's scrapbook. Now, this road, he gestured to the gravel path, is a county DID easement for utility and emergency access, which means by blocking it, you are committing a crime, a real one, not one you made up. He then turned his gaze on Gary, who flinched, as if he'd been physically struck. And you, the sheriff said, his voice dropping, take off that vest. You are not security. You are not law enforcement. You pull a stunt like this again, and the only uniform you'll be wearing is an orange jumpsuit. You understand me, son? Gary, utterly broken, could only nod. Fumbling to rip the Velcro vest off his body, Carol was trembling now, but not with fear, with pure, unadulterated rage. This was not how her fantasy was supposed to go. This ignorant small-town cop was siding with the rule breaker. He was an agent of chaos, not order. This is an outrage, she proclaimed. Mr. Stone's barn is an eyesore. It violates every principle of aesthetic harmony. We are trying to protect our investment, to build a better community. Ma'am, you are trying to harass your neighbor, the sheriff said, his voice now cold and hard. And you're doing it on public land. I am going to give you exactly one opportunity to avoid a trip to my jail. You will dismantle this art project, right now. You will clear every cone, every piece of that broken sawhorse, and that ridiculous banner. And you will go home. This was the final line in the sand, a direct order from a figure of undeniable authority. For a sane person, it would be the end. But Carol Covington was not sane, not on this subject. To retreat now would be to admit she was wrong, and she was never wrong. No, she said, her voice a low, venomous whisper. This is a legitimate association property. Those sawhorses belong to the HOA. That banner is an official HOA.com. In the week following the demolition of her authority, Carol Covington's home office, transformed what was once a sterile testament to minimalist design, became the nerve center of a covert war. A command bunker papered with the munitions of bureaucracy. The sleek, empty surfaces of her desk were now cluttered with printouts of county ordinances, annotated zoning maps, and stacks of official-looking forms downloaded from the bleakest corners of government websites. Carol had failed. With the clumsy instruments of force, now, she would wield the scalpel of regulation, and she was discovering she had a surgeon's touch for finding a rival's softest, most vulnerable tissues. She had spent 3 sleepless nights fueled by black coffee and a venomous, all-consuming rage. Her humiliation at the hands of Sheriff Miller had burned away any lingering pretense of civic duty. This was no longer about property values or aesthetic harmony. This was about retribution. This was about grinding Jedediah Stone into dust under the full, oppressive weight of the systems he had so smugly sixed on her. Her first call was a masterpiece of disingenuous concern. Using a voice-altering app on her phone that dropped her pitch and added a slight, gravelly quaver, she became Marge, a worried, elderly neighbor. She called the Oconee County Planning and Zoning Department. "Hello," she began, her voice trembling with manufactured fragility. I don't want to cause any trouble, but I live down on Whispering Pines Road, and there's a gentleman there, a Mr. Stone. He's a lovely man, just lovely. But, well, he's running what looks like a full-blown factory out of his barn. Big trucks coming and going. The noise from the south. I'm just so worried about what it's doing to our quiet residential neighborhood." She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. The woman on the other end, a harried-sounding clerk named Susan, sighed audibly. "A commercial business in a residential zone. Do you have an address, Marge?" "Oh yes," Carol said, providing Yet's address with crisp precision. "I do hope I'm not making a fuss. I just believe in rules, you know?" She ended the call, and a vicious, triumphant smile spread across her face. The first missile was launched. The second was even more insidious. For this, she filled out IRS Form 3949A, Information Referral. Anonymously, of course. In the section for details, she let her imagination run wild, painting a picture of a thriving off-the-books criminal enterprise. Subject operates a high-end custom furniture business entirely in cash. She typed, "I have personally witnessed dozens of transactions where large sums of cash were exchanged. Customers arrive in luxury vehicles, often after dark. Subject brags about not needing to pay taxes like us regular folks, believed to be hiding hundreds of thousands in undeclared income." Every word was a lie, a carefully crafted fiction designed to trigger every alarm bell within the Internal Revenue Service. She printed the form, placed it in a plain white envelope, and decided she would drive to the next town over to mail it, just to be safe. Her third and final prong of the initial attack was OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. This one was personal. This one was aimed at the heart of his sanctuary. She filed an online complaint, detailing a nightmarish workshop, no visible fire suppression system despite high volume of combustible sawdust, inadequate ventilation, air is thick with dust and chemical fumes from lacquers, no emergency shutoffs on heavy machinery, unsafe wiring observed, with frayed cords, and overloaded outlets, imminent danger of fire, explosion, or serious injury. She had never set foot in his barn, but in her mind's eye, it was a death trap, and she described it with the vivid detail of a first-hand witness. With the 3 complaints filed, Carol felt a profound sense of satisfaction she hadn't felt since her husband had announced he was leaving. Richard had sought chaos with his yoga instructor. Carol was reimposing order, her order, on the world. The physical world had resisted her. The world of paper, of rules and statutes and endless soul-crushing regulations would not now. She just needed to bring her lieutenants back into the fold. She summoned Brenda and Gary to her living room that evening. The mood was funereal. Gary, stripped of his security vest and his purpose, looked like a deflated balloon. Brenda clutched a cup of chamomile tea as if it were a life preserver. "I've asked you here," Carol began, her voice calm and measured, "to discuss the next phase of our operation." Brenda flinched. "Operation Carol, I still have nightmares about that police car. I think my husband is going to pay my fine for me because he's afraid I'll have a panic attack at the courthouse." "There will be no more police cars, Brenda," Carol said soothingly. "There will be no more public confrontations. I have come to realize that our previous methods were unsophisticated. We were fighting on his terms. Now, we fight on ours." She laid out the new strategy. She spoke of zoning violations, tax investigations, and safety inspections. As she spoke, Brenda's face grew paler and paler. "The IRS," Brenda whispered, her voice cracking. "Carol, that's not ... that's not a game. That's the government, the real federal government. They can ruin people's lives." "Precisely," Carol said with a serene smile. "He chose to involve the authorities. We are simply ensuring a thorough investigation by all relevant parties. It's the responsible thing to do." Gary, who had been staring at his scuffed loafers, looked up. "So, what do you need us to do?" "There's nothing to ... to secure here." Carol showed her genius for manipulation. She knew Gary was a man adrift, a man who desperately needed a mission. "On the contrary, Gary," she said, leaning forward, "your role is now more important than ever. We are moving from overt enforcement to covert intelligence gathering." Gary sat up a little straighter. The word covert acted on him like a shot of adrenaline. "I need eyes on the target," Carol continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "I need surveillance. I need you to discreetly monitor the Stone property. I need photographs, with timestamps of every vehicle that comes and goes. We need to build a dossier, a pattern of life analysis. When the investigators come asking questions, we need to have a file ready for them. This isn't about strong-arming anyone, Gary. This is about information. Information is power." The transformation was instantaneous. Gary's posture straightened, his chest puffed out. He was no longer a disgraced mall cop. He was an intelligence operative. "A dossier," he repeated, savoring the word. "Pattern of life. Roger that. Chairperson, I'll set up a blind in my upstairs bedroom. I have a telephoto lens for my DSLR, for ... birdwatching." "Excellent, Gary," Carol said, bestowing a gracious smile upon him. She turned to Brenda. "And Brenda, your role is critical. You will be our records keeper. You will help me organize the evidence Gary collects into a coherent file." She made it sound harmless, like organizing recipes. Brenda still looked terrified, but she was caught between her fear of the IRS and her fear of disappointing Carol. As always, the latter one out. She gave a weak, watery nod. The committee was back in business. Not as a clumsy gang of enforcers, but as a sleek, modern intelligence agency. Carol felt a thrill course through her. This was so much better. This was clean. This was elegant. And it was going to be so much more destructive. A week passed. Then Gary, with the obsessive focus of a man given a new lease on life, emailed Carol daily reports. 14:32, blue Ford F-150 arrived. Male driver, approx 50s, stayed 15 minutes. Left with a wood slat rocking chair in the bed. See attached photo IMG_4021, or 1903 subject exited barn, carrying what appeared to be a small, carved wooden box. No exchange observed. It was all meaningless. Circumstantial nonsense. But to Carol, it was gold. It was a dossier. She sat by her large picture window for hours each day, a pair of powerful Swarovski binoculars resting on the table beside her. She watched Jedediah Stone come and go. She watched him tending his garden. She watched him sitting on his porch, drinking his coffee. Every placid moment she witnessed fed her rage. How dare he be so calm? How dare he live his life while her machinations were turning, grinding, preparing to chew him up? The waiting was agony. Then on a sunny Wednesday morning, it happened. A white, nondescript sedan with a small Oconee County seal on the door pulled into Yet's driveway. A man in a short-sleeved collared shirt and ill-fitting trousers got out, a clipboard in his hand. Brenda, Gary, fits happening. Carol spoke into her phone on a conference call she had initiated the moment the car appeared. Asset on the ground. Repeat, asset on the ground. Copy that, chairperson. Gary's voice crackled back, filled with static and self-import. I have visual male. 50s appears to be a county-level functionary. Oh my goodness, came Brenda's panicked whisper. It's real, he's really there. Through her binoculars, Carol had a front-row seat. She saw Jed come out of his house. She saw him shake the man's hand. The man was talking, gesturing with his clipboard. Jed was listening, his expression unreadable. Then, to Carol's immense satisfaction, they both turned and began walking toward the barn. They disappeared inside. The next 20 minutes were the most exquisitely painful and delicious of Carol's life. She imagined the inspector's eyes widening at the sight of the unsafe conditions. She pictured him measuring, taking notes, his pen scratching out violation after violation. She imagined Jed's quiet life crumbling around him. The Jedediah Stone's threat echoed in the silent, cavernous spaces of Carol Covington's home long after he was gone. Before you start pulling on every official thread, you had better be damn sure your own tapestry is flawless. It was, she told herself, the desperate parting shot of a guilty man, a pathetic attempt to frighten her, to throw her off her righteous course. She was Carol Covington. Her life was a monument to meticulous planning and flawless execution. Her house, designed by the celebrated modernist architect Antoine Dubois, was a testament to precision. It was a fortress of glass and steel and imported Italian marble. Flawless. She repeated the word to herself as she paced her living room. Flawless. But the word felt hollow. A seed of doubt, cold and sharp, had been planted in the fertile ground. Of her obsessive mind, Jed's threat wasn't a wild accusation. It was specific. Surveys, permits, blueprints. He was telling her he knew where to look. That night, sleep offered no escape. Her dreams were a chaotic fever of shifting property lines and sneering county officials rolling measuring wheels through her living room. She awoke before dawn, drenched in a cold sweat, the quiet threat still ringing in her ears. She went to her office, but not to plot her next attack on Jed. Instead, she unlocked a large, fireproof safe, hidden behind a minimalist print of a single black line on a white canvas. From it, she retrieved a thick, leather-bound portfolio. It contained every document related to her house, the original deed, the bewilderingly complex architectural blueprints, the building permits, the certificates of occupancy, the complete, documented history of her fortress. For the next 2 days, she became a hermit, a scholar of her own perfection. She spread the massive blueprints across her dining room table, weighing down the corners with heavy art books. She cross-referenced the architect's elegant drawings with the dry, brutally technical land survey she had downloaded from the county website. She read every line of fine print, every notation, her eyes growing raw from the strain. It's an act of desperation, she muttered to her reflection in the dark glass of the window, trying to convince herself. He has nothing. Her committee, her fledgling intelligence agency, tried to intervene. Gary called, his voice buzzing with a newfound sense of purpose. Chairperson, I have a significant update. Subject received a package delivery from a company specializing in woodworking tools. Appears to be a new bandsaw. This could be a violation of the spirit, if not the letter, of the cease and desist. Requesting permission to log it as provocative escalation. Not now, Gary, Carol snapped, her eyes tracing a faint topographical line on the survey map. But chairperson, the mission is on hold. She shrieked and slammed the phone down. Brenda was next. Carol, are you okay? Gary said. You sounded ... stressed. I brought you some scones. I can leave them on the Brenda. Do you know what a setback variance is? Carol demanded without preamble. What? Is that a type of scone? Carol hung up without another word. Her allies were useless. They didn't understand the new terrifying terrain of this war. It had turned inward. Before she could continue her offensive, she had to be absolutely certain of her own defenses. On the third day, she took her crusade outdoors. Armed with a state-of-the-art laser distance measurer, she began a fanatical audit of her own property. She looked like a madwoman, a high priestess of suburban anxiety performing a bizarre ritual. She measured the distance from her mailbox to the curb, comparing it to the Whispering Pines Development's original covenant document she'd once scorned. 48.5 inches. The covenant specified a maximum of 48. A flicker of panic, she adjusted the post with a mallet, hammering it a half-inch deeper into the earth, her hands trembling. She measured the height of her privacy fence. 6 feet, 1/4 inch. The ordinance allowed for 6 feet exactly. She spent the next hour sanding the top of the fence posts down with a power sander, a fine mist of cedar dust settling on her expensive linen blouse. Gary drove by on one of his patrols and saw her on her hands and knees. The laser measure pressed against the grout lines of her sprawling back patio. He slowed his golf cart to a stop. Carol, everything all right? She looked up, her hair disheveled. a wild look in her eyes. The grout lines are specified to be 1/8 of an inch. Antoine Dubois himself insisted on it. This one is 3/16. It's a fraud. Gary stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. The formidable chairperson, Covington, the master strategist who had talked of dossiers and covert operations, was having a nervous breakdown over a grout line. He backed his golf cart away slowly and drove off, shaking his head. That night, hunched over the dining room table, under the glare of a single spotlight, she found it. It wasn't on the architect's plans. They were, as she knew, perfect. It was on the final as-built survey filed with the county by the developer's construction crew just before they went bankrupt. A small, almost imperceptible difference between the planned layout of the back patio in its final position, a faint, dotted line representing the property boundary, and the solid, unforgiving line of her patio. They weren't parallel. At one end, near the custom-built gas fire pit, the elegant Italian tile of her patio crossed the property line. She broke out in a cold sweat, her hands shaking as she grabbed a ruler. She measured the distance on the scaled map. It was 1.5 feet, 18 inches. Her patio, her magnificent 5-figure Dubois-approved patio, was encroaching 18 inches onto the adjacent lot. Her fortress had a breach. She stumbled back from the table, a gasp escaping her lips. The adjacent lot was an undeveloped parcel of woodland, owned by a defunct holding company in Delaware. It was nothing, but it wasn't her nothing. The violation was real. It was on a public document. It was exactly the kind of thing Jedediah Stone, a man who knew land and construction, would look for, and it was exactly the kind of thing he could use to bring her perfect world crashing down. The fear didn't humble her. It didn't chasten her. It ignited a firestorm of pure, unadulterated rage. Rage at the incompetent builder. Rage at the bankrupt developer. But most of all, rage at Jedediah Stone for forcing her to see the imperfection she never knew existed. He had made her vulnerable. She stormed into her office. Her brief defensive posture was over. The only way to survive was to attack, to obliterate him so completely and so quickly that he would never get the chance to use the weapon he had so cleverly uncovered. The zoning complaint was too slow. The IRS was a long game. She needed a cannon. And then she found it. The Georgia Environmental Protection Division, the EPD. Their powers were broad, their fines were crippling, and their purview and water, air was elemental. She picked up her phone, activated the Marge voice again, and dialed. Her hand was steady now, her voice a cold, hard instrument of vengeance. Hello EPD, I need to file an urgent, anonymous complaint, she began, her voice filled with a synthetic, environmentalist fervor. There's a man, he has a workshop, and I've seen him, with my own eyes, pouring buckets of oily, chemical-smelling liquid into the little creek at the back of his property, the one that runs down toward the reservoir. I think he's poisoning our water. It was her most audacious lie to date, vicious, specific, and aimed directly at the land he loved. She gave them his name and address. This time, she knew they would come, and they would not be carrying clipboards. They would be carrying sample kits and the full, crushing weight of federal environmental law. Carol didn't have to wait long. Less than a week later, an official Ford Ranger with the green EPD logo pulled up to Yet's property. A man got out, but he was nothing like the rumpled, world-weary Mr. Henderson from zoning. This man was young, fit with a sharp, intelligent face and an air of intense seriousness. He wore rugged field boots, cargo pants, and a polo shirt embroidered. With his title, Dr. Eris Thorne, field scientist, he was carrying 2 large, professional-looking aluminum cases. Carol watched through her binoculars, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. This was it, the knockout blow. She saw Jed meet Dr. Thorne at the end of the driveway. Their conversation was longer this time. Jed was gesturing, shaking his head. He looked different. The quiet calm was gone, replaced by a tight, coiled anger. He looked like a man who had been pushed past his limit. But he was cooperative. He led Dr. Thorne around the back of the house, toward the barn and the small seasonal creek that trickled through the woods behind it. For the next hour, Carol watched, mesmerized, as the scientist conducted his work. He put on blue nitrile gloves. He opened his cases, revealing racks of sterile glass vials, soil augers, and electronic testing equipment. He knelt by the creek, taking water samples. He used the auger to pull up cores of soil from the bank. He photographed everything. He was thorough, professional, and utterly terrifying. Carol felt a surge of ecstatic power. This was her creation. This meticulous, scientific dismantling of Yet's life was happening because of her will. Get him, she whispered at the window, fogging the glass. Find it. Find the poison. Finally, Dr. Thorne packed up his kits. He and Jed walked back to the front of the house. They stood by the EPD truck, talking. Carol zoomed in with her binoculars, trying to read their lips. Thorne was explaining the process. The samples would go to the lab in Atlanta. Result? The world, seen through the Swarovski lenses, wobbled and distorted. Dr. Thorne's gaze, fixed upon her house, was not merely a look. It was an indictment. The folder in his hand was not paper. It was a verdict. Carol Covington lowered the binoculars, her movements stiff and robotic. A high-pitched ringing began in her ears, drowning out the placid afternoon sounds of her perfect neighborhood. Her fortress, her immaculate sanctuary of order, had been breached, not by a physical force, but by a simple manila folder. The foundation itself was compromised. She stumbled back from the window, a strangled gasp escaping her lips. The air in her climate-controlled living room suddenly felt thick, unbreathable. The minimalist white walls seemed to be closing in, the right angles of the furniture appearing sharp and accusatory. For the first time since Richard had walked out, Carol felt the cold, terrifying grip of a genuine panic attack. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel. She needed to do something to regain control. Her eyes darted around the room and landed on a tall, impossibly slender porcelain vase on a pedestal in the corner. It was a one-of-a-kind piece she had acquired at a gallery in Milan. It was perfect. She strode toward it, her breath coming in ragged sobs, and with a guttural scream of pure, undiluted rage, she swept it from its pedestal. It shattered on the marble floor, the sound like a gunshot in the pristine silence. The sight of the broken shards, the first-ever crack in the perfect veneer of her home, did not calm her. It only fed the fire. Her hands shaking, she snatched her phone and speed-dialed her committee. Brenda and Gary answered on the conference line, their voices a muddle of greetings. Pinu. Carol shrieked into the phone, her voice raw and unrecognizable. The whole time, he knew. He was playing with me. He let me file the complaint. He led the inspector right to my own doorstep. Whoa, chairperson. Slow down, Gary said. What happened? Did the EPD guy find something? He found a folder. She wailed. A folder Jedediah gave him, with my survey in it, my patio, the watershed. He's turned it all back on me. This is your fault. Our fault. Brenda squeaked, her voice trembling. How is this our fault? Your intelligence was weak, Carol accused, pacing through the wreckage of the vase. Your surveillance was useless. You were supposed to be watching him, Gary. You were supposed to anticipate his moves. You were so busy logging his Amazon packages that you missed him plotting my complete and total destruction. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. Then Gary's voice, cold and stripped of its usual bluster, came through. I provided you with daily, detailed reports. Chairperson, I did the job you asked me to do. If you wanted a psychic, you should have hired one. My services, he said, the words dripping with wounded pride, are no longer required. The line clicked as he hung up. Gary, Carol said, stunned. But he was gone, Brenda. She could hear Brenda sobbing openly now. I can't do this anymore. Carol, the police, the IRS, the EPD, and now he's coming after you. I told you we were going too far. I'm out, Carol, I'm out. The second click echoed Carol's sudden, terrifying isolation. She was alone. Her allies, her followers, her entire power base, as pathetic as it was, had evaporated in an instant. She sank onto her white leather sofa, staring at the shattered remains of the vase on the floor. Her perfect life was a pile of broken porcelain. 3 days later, the nightmare took on an official letterhead. A stern-faced postal carrier, the kind who looked like he brooked no nonsense, required her signature for a certified envelope from the Georgia Environmental Protection Division. The paper felt heavy in her trembling hands, each gram an ounce of doom. She slid it open with a silver letter opener, her heart pounding a sick rhythm against her ribs. The language within was cold, merciless, and utterly devoid of human emotion. Notice of potential violation and order for investigation. She read on, her eyes scanning the bureaucratic prose that laid out her ruin. Potential violation of the Georgia Water Quality Control Act. Unpermitted construction of a non-permeable surface over a designated primary watershed. Potential for contaminated runoff. The order was explicit. She was required at her own expense to hire a state-certified geological engineering firm to conduct a comprehensive impact study. They were to perform soil, borings, water permeability tests, and create a report to determine if her patio was negatively affecting the watershed. Failure to submit this report within 60 days would result in an immediate fine of $10,000, followed by penalties of up to $25,000 per day for continued not. And then came the final, soul-crushing paragraph. Should the investigation conclude that the structure poses a risk to the watershed's integrity, the EPD reserves the right to issue a restoration order, requiring the complete removal of the offending structure and the restoration of the land to its original state. Removal, demolition. They were going to make her tear down her patio, her beautiful, perfect, architect-designed patio. The horror of it was so profound it left her breathless. The weapon she had so expertly aimed at Jed's barn had misfired and was about to blow her own house apart. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she could not fight this alone. She was out of her depth, drowning in a sea of regulations she didn't understand. She needed a shark. Silas Croft-esque, operated out of a top-floor office in Buckhead, Atlanta, that smelled of old leather, expensive scotch, and ruthless victory. He was a small, impeccably tailored man in a charcoal suit, with a hawk-like face and eyes that seemed to assess a person's net worth in a single, dismissive glance. He specialized in defending the very wealthy from the consequences of their own hubris, particularly in matters of land use and zoning. His hourly rate was obscene. Carol, trying to project an aura of calm, wronged dignity, sat opposite his vast mahogany desk and laid out her story. She painted herself as the victim, a civic-minded homeowner being targeted by a vindictive rule-breaking neighbor. She glossed over the barricade and her own anonymous complaints, presenting only Jed's actions and the EPD's draconian response. Silas Croft listened without interruption, his fingertips steepled under his chin. He did not take a single note. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, his cold eyes boring into her. "Let me see the letter from the EPD," he said, his voice a dry rasp. She handed it over. He read it in less than a minute. Then he looked at the survey map she provided, the one with the damning 18-inch encroachment. "Let me see if I have this correct. Ms. Covington," he began, his tone utterly devoid of sympathy. "You were engaged in a dispute with your neighbor. In an attempt to gain leverage, you anonymously reported him to the Environmental Protection Division for allegedly polluting a watershed. He was running an illegal business," Carol interjected. Croft held up a hand, silencing her. "You directed a powerful state agency's attention to a specific geographical feature, this creek. Your neighbor, who appears to be considerably more clever than you gave him credit for, then simply handed that same agency official documentation proving that UHL had built an unpermitted structure directly over the same watershed you were so concerned about." He leaned back in his chair. "From a legal perspective, Ms. Covington, this is what we call a tactical own goal of catastrophic proportions. You didn't just hand him a weapon. You pulled the trigger for him, while pointing the barrel at your own foot." Carol's face burned with humiliation. "What can we do?" she whispered. "Your options are poor and expensive," Croft said bluntly. "Option A, we comply. You hire a geological engineer. Best case, it costs you $20,000 to $30,000 for the report, which will conclude your patio is a problem. Then we spend another $50,000 in engineering and construction fees to fix it, if a fix is even possible. Option B, we fight. I can file injunctions, motions to dismiss, challenges to the EPD's jurisdiction. This will bog them down for a year, maybe two. It will cost you upwards of $150,000 in my fees alone, and at the end of it, we will almost certainly lose, at which point you will still have to pay for the reports and the demolition. So, the question is, how much money would you like to set on fire?" He paused, letting the numbers sink in. "My retainer, by the way, is $50,000, payable by the end of business today. I take wire transfers or a cashier's check." The room swam before Carol's eyes. The money wasn't the issue. It was the absolute certainty of the loss. The cold, hard reality that her own actions had led her to a dead end, with a price tag that could have bought a luxury car. She had been so sure of her own cleverness, and it had led her to this. To a hawk-faced lawyer who was already mentally spending her money, driving back from Atlanta in a daze, Carol knew that the legal route was a fool's errand. It was a slow, expensive path to the same conclusion, her defeat. Silas Croft wasn't a savior. He was an undertaker, offering her a choice of a plain pine box or a gilded casket. She needed another way. She needed leverage, something to force Jedediah Stone to withdraw his complaint. If his complaint went away, the EPD might lose interest. She needed something so powerful, so damaging, that he would have no choice but to back down. That night, her office became a different kind of war room. Jedediah Stone's promise in the parking lot was not a threat of violence. It was a declaration of a different kind of war, and Carol Covington, for all her tactical scheming, had no idea how to fight it. She understood the language of bylaws, fines, and anonymous complaints. She did not understand the language of a good man's righteous fury. Her paranoia, once a tool she directed outward, now turned on her like a rabid dog. Jed's quiet, simmering rage was a shapeless phantom that haunted every corner of her glass and steel prison. Every car that slowed on the street below was him, watching. Every rustle of leaves in the wind was him, approaching. The sharp ring of the telephone was him, calling to deliver his promised reckoning. She had new locks installed, then a full-blown security system with motion detectors and cameras, which she monitored on a dedicated screen in her office, her face a pale, haunted mask in the bluish glow of the feeds. She had her groceries delivered, refusing to set foot outside. Her fortress, once a symbol of her dominance over the neighborhood, had become her gilded cage. The woman who had tried to control everyone could no longer even control her own fear. Meanwhile, Jedediah Stone began his campaign. It was not a campaign of whispers and lies, but one of quiet, devastating truth. He invited the Perkinses, the couple who had shunned him in the market, over for iced tea on his porch. He didn't speak of Carol or her harassment. He spoke of Martha. Brought out an old photo album, the pages worn and soft at the edges. He showed them pictures of their wedding, of the two of them, covered in sawdust and laughing, during the restoration of the barn. Of Martha at her easel, a smudge of paint on her nose, her eyes bright with life. Then, with a voice thick with the grief that 7 years had not erased, He told them about the day she died. He told them about the box of old college textbooks she'd insisted on retrieving, about her misstep on the attic stairs, about the horrific final sound of her fall. He showed them a copy of the coroner's report. The words, accidental death, stark and unequivocal. Marianne Perkins began to weep, not just for the tragedy, but for her own gullibility, for the part she had played in amplifying such a monstrous lie. By the end of the week, Jed had had similar quiet conversations with half a dozen of the neighborhood's key figures. The story of Carol's vicious rumor spread like wildfire, but this time, it was attached to the truth of her cruelty. The community's sentiment, already soured by her HOA antics, curdled into outright revulsion. She was no longer an eccentric nuisance. She was a ghoul who had danced on a good woman's grave. When she chanced to glance out her window, she saw her neighbors not as subjects, but as a silent jury, their faces cold and condemning. Her isolation was now absolute. But her fear of Yet's promise remained. What was he going to do? The uncertainty was a corrosive acid, eating away at the last of her sanity. Believing a physical assault was imminent, she made her final stand. She called a high-end security firm and, at a ruinous cost, had them install a heavy black iron gate at the entrance to her driveway. It was 10 feet tall, with sharpened spires. Operated by a remote keypad, it was an ugly, brutalist statement, a final, desperate act of control that sealed her off completely. As the gate slid shut for the first time with a heavy metallic thunk, Carol felt a fleeting sense of safety. She was secure. No one could get to her. What she didn't know was that Jed's final move had nothing to do with her gate. He had taken her own advice. He had kept pulling on the threads of her flawless tapestry. He hired a private investigator, a retired GBI agent from Athens, and gave him a simple task: investigate Carol Covington's finances, specifically around the time of her divorce. It didn't take long. The investigator, methodical and patient, uncovered what Carol's husband and his high-priced lawyers had missed. A shell corporation, registered in Nevada, a year before the divorce proceedings began. A series of quiet transfers from a joint investment account into the shell corporation's coffers. It was a classic case of hiding marital assets, a felony. Jed didn't take the information to the IRS. He didn't send an anonymous tip to a blogger. He put the investigator's entire file into a neat, organized binder. Then he made an appointment to see Sheriff Frank Miller. In the sheriff's office, Jed laid the binder on the desk. "Frank," he said quietly, "I know you're tired of this. So am I, but this is where it ends." Sheriff Miller spent 20 minutes reading the file. He saw the bank statements, the incorporation papers, the timeline that clearly showed intent to defraud. This wasn't a neighborhood squabble anymore. This wasn't a zoning dispute or an illegal barricade. This was concrete evidence of a serious, premeditated crime. He looked up at Jed, his expression grim. "You know, Jed, most folks in your position would have just built a higher fence. She brought my wife into it, Frank," Jed said, his voice low and heavy. "There are no fences high enough for that." The sheriff nodded slowly. He picked up his phone and dialed the district attorney's office. A search warrant for all financial records and computer equipment at the residence of Carol Covington wouldn't be hard to get. The convoy arrived at 9 a.m. on a crisp autumn morning. 3 sheriff's cruisers and an unmarked sedan from the DA's office. They pulled up to Carol's new, menacing gate. Carol, who was obsessively watching her security feeds, saw them arrive. Her mind, shattered by paranoia, couldn't process the reality of the situation. She didn't see law enforcement. She saw Jed's private army, the final phase of his plan to destroy her. Sheriff Miller's voice boomed through a loudspeaker, the sound echoing across the manicured lawns of Whispering Pines. "Carol Covington, this is Sheriff Frank Miller. We have a warrant to search these premises." "Open the gate." "Go away," she shrieked, her voice a distorted squawk over the security system's intercom. "You have no jurisdiction here. This is private property. You are trespassing. I'm calling my lawyer." "Ma'am, we are the jurisdiction," Miller's voice boomed back, devoid of patience. "You have 10 seconds to open this gate, or we will open it for you." "Never," she screamed. "You're in on it with him, all of you." Sheriff Miller sighed and looked at the deputy in the driver's seat of the heavy-duty patrol SUV, equipped with a push bumper. "Do it." The deputy nodded, shifted the vehicle into drive, and aimed for the gate's locking mechanism. The SUV surged forward, and with a deafening shriek of tortured metal, the iron gate buckled, bent, and burst inward, torn from its concrete moorings. The sound was not just the destruction of a gate, it was the sound of the last wall of Carol Covington's world coming down. This time, when the barricade was crashed, it wasn't a symbol, it was an execution of the law. Deputies swarmed the property. They used a ram to open the front door. They found Carol in her office, frantically trying to smash her laptop on the floor. She fought them, kicking and screaming about conspiracies and corrupt cops, her elegant clothes torn, her face a mask of feral rage. They led her out of her house in handcuffs. The woman who had obsessed over every rule, who had built her life around the concept of order, was now a chaotic, screaming mess in the custody of the very system she had tried to weaponize. From the end of the road, standing by his old pickup truck, Jedediah Stone watched the scene unfold. There was no triumph on his face, no hint of a smile. Just a profound and weary sadness. He had won. He had protected his home, his life, his wife's memory, but he had been forced to descend into a darkness he never wanted to know, forced to fight a war he never started. He watched until the cruisers pulled away, taking Carol Covington with them, leaving a silence over the neighborhood that felt both peaceful and scarred. Months later, the seasons had turned. A for sale by bank sign was hammered into Carol Covington's perfect lawn. Her house stood empty, a monument to a fallen tyrant. The EPD investigation, fueled by the evidence Jed had provided, had quickly concluded that Carol's patio was a significant violation. Rather than face the legal battle and demolition costs from a jail cell, she had surrendered the property to the bank as part of a complex settlement of her numerous legal and financial woes. Her illegal patio was now a pile of rubble and upturned earth, waiting for nature to reclaim it. The threat to Jed's barn was gone forever. The Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association was a memory. A strange and cautionary tale whispered among the neighbors. On a warm spring afternoon, Jed stood in his barn. The light, smelling of sawdust and new blossoms, streamed through the large window of Martha's old studio. The whole ugly affair was over. He had his peace, he had his sanctuary, but it had come at a cost. The fight had dredged up a grief he had carefully packed away, and it had forced him to wield a hardness he preferred to keep sheathed. He walked over to the easel that had stood untouched for 7 years. Upon it rested the unfinished canvas, the gentle, rolling hills of North Georgia, waiting for a final touch of color in the sky. He looked at it for a long, long time. The memory of her laughter in this very room, was so clear it was almost a physical presence. A single tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. He reached out a calloused, gentle hand, and picked up one of her brushes, its wooden handle smooth and familiar. He squeezed a small dab of cerulean blue onto a palette. Mixing it with a touch of white, he looked from the paint to the